Since we can use the teleportation array, let's hurry and get out of here, Shi Jingxuan urged. If heavenly lightning struck here and destroyed the water manor, then they'd only elicit greater animosity. Dismantling a heavenly official's temple was an attack on their brand, and they would surely develop a deep hatred for the culprit. It was unclear whether the ghost realm had the same taboo, but surely no one would like it if their house was demolished for no reason. Mingyi dipped his fingers into the blood from his wounds, and stood with some difficulty to prepare the array. Where to? And who's going first? Lord Earthmaster, you have to go first, you're wounded, Shilian said. However, Mingyi shook his head. The array needs to be redrawn after each use. None of you know how to draw it, so I have to stay behind. Then, Mingxiong, I'll stay with you and go second to last, Shi Qingxuan said. What are you saying? Shi Wudu snapped. Right now, you're... Even if you stay, you'll be of no use. Leave first, right now, and go to the East Sea. Right now, everyone is equally useless, so what does it matter? Shi Qingxuan countered. This whole thing has nothing to do with Mingxiong, but he had to suffer like this. He sighed. I feel really bad. We're all being sent to the same place anyway. It won't take long. What are you afraid of? Shi Wudu persisted. In the past, Shi Wudu would lecture a word or two at most, and Shi Qingxuan would always listen. Things were different now, and Shi Qingxuan wasn't listening anymore. He pushed against each of Shi Wudu's demands. If we leave like this, what about General Pei? Won't he be left behind? Shi Wudu had also noticed that his little brother wasn't as obedient as he once was, and his expression grew complicated. A moment later, he replied, It's fine. Pei Xiong's stubborn and resilient. He'll be able to hang on until we get reinforcements from heaven. Shilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Although his instincts told him the Water Master was right, and didn't mean any harm by his words, he still felt sorry for Pei Ming. After a pause, he said, Hold on a minute. The group looked at him. Lord Earthmaster, are you sure this chamber can really be used for the teleportation array? Shilian asked. Could there be any unforeseen issues? I don't think it's wise to rush in so carelessly. Why don't we test it first? At that, Mingyi's hand really did pause. How? We'll still need a volunteer to test it. Shi Qingxuan raised his hand. Then I volunteer. Huacheng hadn't spoken throughout the whole conversation, but now he crossed his arms and announced his thoughts. Sorry to interrupt. Have none of you realized the problem with that? And what is my lord's expert opinion? Mingyi asked. How will you know if the volunteer arrives at the intended destination? Huacheng pointed out. Shilian blinked. That's true. Lord Earthmaster did say this array only goes one way, which meant the person would not be able to return after being sent over, and couldn't let the others know if they safely arrived at the proper destination. They'd forgotten to consider this matter. This deserted island was isolated from the outside world, and the spiritual communication array was blocked. It would appear they'd come to a dead end. So, further discussion is meaningless, Huacheng concluded. It's one simple decision. Go or leave. Get this over with quickly. Scared? Then stay. Although Huacheng was smiling, Shilian could sense he was uneasy, like he wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. He'd been anxious ever since they were brought back to the island by the dragon Shi Wudu summoned, and it was only getting worse. Shi Wudu also didn't want to wait any longer. Heavenly thunder was crashing in his ears. It would strike sooner or later if he didn't leave, and that would be an unpleasant time for everyone. So he stormed into the side chamber and slammed the door behind him. Mingyi quickly finished drawing the array, and when they opened the door once more, faint smoke wafted from inside the empty chamber. Done, Mingyi said. Next. Then, Your Highness, Shi Qingxuan began to speak. Before he could finish, Mingyi grabbed him and stuffed him inside the chamber. He slammed the door shut and completed the array. The second time he opened the door, Mingyi looked at the remaining two. Sunlun, why don't you go first? Shilian offered. However, Huacheng pulled him along into the chamber. We go together, he said darkly. Shilian was confused. But doesn't this array only allow for one at a time? I'm not a living human. Don't worry, Huacheng said. Shilian still felt there was something worrisome afoot, but he couldn't put his finger on what it might be. Huacheng brought him inside the chamber and gave a curt order to Mingyi. Puchi Shrine. Mingyi nodded in silent reply. The door slowly closed in front of Shilian, and through the closing gap, he could see Mingyi's ashen expression. In spite of himself, he wondered, can Lord Earthmaster really make it through this? Huacheng pulled the door fully shut himself, waited for a moment, then opened it again. And they were greeted by the interior of Puchi Shrine. It was the middle of the night, and Chirong's snores roared like thunder. He was sprawled out like he'd been violently murdered, and was hugging the blanket. Guzi used to have a proper sleeping posture, but his cheap dad's bad influence had taken its toll. Presently, he was draped over Chirong's stomach like a dead fish. In contrast, Lang Ying was curled properly in a corner, using a few shirts as covers. Shilian lifted the blanket covering Qirong, suppressed the urge to smother him with it, and instead covered the two small children. "We're back?" he whispered. Huacheng closed the door behind him. "Yes, it's over." "Not yet, I don't think," Shilian said. "We don't know if Lord Windmaster and the others are safe." Pushing the door open very lightly, he walked outside. Only then did he raise his voice to call out in the spiritual communication array they'd set up earlier. "Lord Earthmaster, is everyone back?" There was no response. Shilian thought that perhaps Mingyi might not have made it back quickly, so he entered the communication array of the upper court. He had no way of knowing before he entered, but it was complete chaos inside. He jumped in surprise at the noise. Every heavenly official was yelling, and even Ling Wen was throwing a fit. "Don't throw every bit of useless information my way. How much do you think I have to go through every day? Don't any of you know how to use your brains before asking me?" "Ling Wen," Shilian called out hastily, "have Lord Watermaster and the others not returned?" Ling Wen instantly caught hold of him, and she seemed to change into a completely different person. "Your Highness, why is your voice so loud? Have you returned from the East Sea? Where did Lord Watermaster and General Pei go? Why haven't we heard from them?" "I came back from the South Sea," Shilian said. "The South Sea?" "The South Sea, specifically the Blackwater Demon Lair." Ling Wen was dumbfounded. "But how did you end up there? We never go near that place. Are old Pei and the others still there?" "It's a long story," Shilian said. While Lord Watermaster was facing his tribulation, we accidentally stumbled into Blackwater Demon Lair. We just escaped. He and Lord Windmaster left before I did, so they should have reached the East Sea by now. Have you not seen them?" "No," Ling Wen said. "The East Sea calmed down a while ago, and those 200-something fishermen have all been rescued. But there's no trace of those two on the shores or the sea." "How can that be?" Shilian exclaimed. Unless what?" "Unless what?" Ling Wen asked anxiously. Your Highness, do you have something else to say? Should we send heavenly officials to the South Sea right now?" "It's too late," Shilian muttered. He shut down the communication array and rolled around. "Sunlong?" Huacheng seemed like he'd already anticipated his question. His hands were clasped behind his back as he gazed at him in solemn silence. "Did the two of you reach some sort of agreement a long time ago?" Shilian asked. Huacheng didn't immediately respond. Just as he began to move his lips, Shilian quickly assured him of his intent. No, don't tell me. You don't have to answer. If you had a prior arrangement with someone, don't go back on your word on my account. I wouldn't want that. It's my fault for asking so suddenly. I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position." "I'm sorry, Your Highness," Huacheng murmured. Shilian shook his head. "Don't apologize. I should have thought of this before. That arrangement must have prevented you from interfering and from directly telling me the truth." Huacheng had tried to talk him out of it, but he hadn't interfered with Shilian's wishes. He accompanied and protected him the whole way, with an escape plan already prepared, except at every turn, something always came up that dragged Shilian deeper into the heart of the affair. "I should be thanking you," Shilian said. "You figured everything out?" Huacheng asked. Shilian nodded. "Pretty much. In fact, I should have figured this out a long time ago. He really is incredible. I'd often overthink it and dismiss my own suspicions, and I wound up overlooking the most straightforward possibility." After a pause, he continued, "And he really did give you face. He put in considerable effort to send me away peacefully and wasted a lot of time on the detour." "Your Highness," Huacheng said, "this whole thing ends here. It's over." Shilian sighed. "I wish that was the case. But he might have crossed the line." There was a moment of silence, and then Huacheng said gently, "Let them take care of their own affairs. You made it home, and there's no way for you to go back to the demon lair anyway." "Don't be so sure," Shilian said. Huacheng froze upon hearing this. "I have an idea. It only came to me just now. I have a way to connect with Lord Windmaster," Shilian said. He started forming a hand seal. "So, I'm sorry, Sunlong. I have to go back for a little while." Huacheng caught on the moment he saw that hand seal. He clearly hadn't expected that move, and his eye widened. "Ugaga," Shilian said, loud and clear. "Soul-shifting spell!" As he closed his eyes, a familiar, weightless sensation seized him, like his soul was yanked out and hurled high into the air before plunging back down again. When he opened his eyes, the sight before him wasn't Huacheng's face. He found himself fleeing through mountainous woods and under an endless, starless night sky. Shilian could hear harsh breathing come from his mouth, and the violent pounding of his heart. Success. The soul-shifting spell wasn't used often, and it burned a great deal of spiritual power. It was stronger than spiritual communication, and considered pretty questionable, so its use was fairly rare. The blocking parameters of spiritual barriers usually didn't take it into consideration. He and Shi Qingxuan had used the soul-shooting spell that fateful night, and Shi Qingxuan hadn't had the chance to seal his spiritual consciousness before he lost his powers and became mortal. To explain further, it was like the two of them had exchanged the keys to each other's houses and made use of each other's home. After they switched back, Shi Qingxuan should have changed the locks on his door so Shilian couldn't re-enter. Because he didn't, Shilian could still use the key from before. However, Shi Qingxuan could no longer open Shilian's door, so the two were now using the same body. Shilian's own body probably had gone limp and collapsed. Perhaps Huacheng had caught him before he hit the ground. Shi Qingxuan was out of breath and completely overwhelmed with terror. It seemed he was fleeing from pursuit. Shilian listened intently and heard the sound of hellish wailing from behind them. It was the band of madmen that had been locked up in the iron prison. They seemed very fond of Shi Qingxuan, even to the point of yearning for him. They pursued him relentlessly, with their eyes rolled back and tongues lolling from their mouths. Shi Qingxuan's ribs and lungs were burning with the strain of his flight. He was on the verge of tears, and he wanted to scream, but he had no voice to do so. Shilian could tell that he was running without mind or method. He wouldn't last much longer like this, so he assumed direct control of the body. "Lord Windmaster!" He used Shi Qingxuan's mouth to speak, and Shi Qingxuan was so surprised he almost bit his tongue. Who's in my body? My lord, please calm down, Shilian said. I've come to you using the soul-shooting spell. Give me your body, I'll help you run. Shilian felt 2 lines of hot tears fly from Shi Qingxuan's eyes. Your Highness, you're so dependable, how reassuring, thank you. No need for thanks, Shilian said. Listen to me, Lord Windmaster, run away. Aren't I already running? Shi Qingxuan exclaimed. I don't mean like this, Shilian explained. I mean you need to escape. As he spoke, several filthy madmen left from the woods and lunged at Shi Qingxuan. Shilian cracked his knuckles and vaulted into the air to unleash 30 rounds of power kicks. The madmen were knocked to the ground, left crying and unable to get back up. Shi Qingxuan's jaw dropped. Did I do that? That's amazing! Martial gods are so awesome! I want to be a martial god now too! Shilian, however, earnestly killed his joy. My lord, you can't. Your physique isn't made for the martial path. The two talked using the same body, as if one person were asking and answering their own questions. From an outside perspective, it was truly bizarre. Lord Windmaster, where's Lord Watermaster? Shilian asked. Shi Qingxuan scanned the area. I don't know where Mingxiong or my brother went. When I opened the door, I was still in another water manor. I was only sent to a different room. I don't know where things went wrong. Without warning, Shilian rolled from the balls of his feet onto his tiptoes and leapt into a tree. Shi Qingxuan didn't understand this change of route, but having his body spring about and move so freely was a curious feeling, so he allowed Shilian to control him as he willed. They lightly and nimbly shimmied onto a tree branch. Your Highness, why did you suddenly... Before Shi Qingxuan could finish, Shilian covered his mouth, which was also his own mouth. Shilian quickly crept to the tip of this branch and kept himself low to hide in the dense leaves. At the end of the road, a slender shadow stumbled into view. Upon closer inspection, it was Ming Yi. He still looked tragic, which gave a dead air to his good looks, though he could still manage to walk. Shi Qingxuan was overjoyed and dropped his hands to call out to him, but Shilian immediately raised his hands to cover his mouth again. This time he used both hands, smothering himself so firmly he could hardly breathe. Shi Qingxuan wasn't a rash person and knew that Shilian must be doing this for a reason, so he didn't fight it. He simply watched as Ming Yi walked past them, down that little path. Once he was gone, Shilian loosened his grip and stealthily slipped out of the tree, then snuck back into the dense woods. After they'd run for a while, Shi Qingxuan glanced back and whispered, Your Highness, why didn't you let me call out to Mingxiong earlier? Shilian's only response was to bring their mad sprint to a dead stop. Shi Qingxuan glanced ahead, and his pupils shrank in an instant. Ming Yi clearly should have been far behind at this point, but here he was, standing right in front of them. Ming Yi supported himself with a nearby tree, and frowned at the sight of Shi Qingxuan. Why are you here too? Shi Qingxuan blurted. Shilian didn't speak, but instead moved a hand behind his back and waved, a sign not to let anyone know there was a third person present. Shi Qingxuan understood, but the furrow of Ming Yi's brow only deepened. What are you hiding? What are you doing with your hand behind your back? Are you hiding something? Shi Qingxuan urgently shoved both hands forward, palms open to show him. No! Shilian could feel his blood run cold, and waves of numbness run down his spine. Although Shi Qingxuan considered Ming Yi very dependable, it seemed his abrupt appearance also gave him quite a fright. Ming Yi looked bewildered. I didn't mean I actually wanted you to show me. His expression was one of disdain, but it was also incredibly familiar. Shi Qingxuan sighed in relief, and the goosebumps that had raised on half his body began to fade. In contrast, Shilian was immensely anxious. but he didn't dare to speak rashly and remained silent. "Where's Lord Watermaster?" Mingyi asked. "You haven't seen my brother either," Shi Jingchuan replied. "I've been looking for him everywhere. Didn't you say you could send us off Blackwater Island? How come His Highness made it back, but we're still here?" Shilian listened and grew more apprehensive with each word spoken between them. While he did his best to suppress Shi Jingchuan's involuntary reflex to giggle when nervous, it wasn't like Shi Jingchuan to speak so seriously. Thus, he furiously tugged at his own hair and pointed at Mingyi, yelling accusations. "Mingsheng, didn't I tell you to practice more in your free time? Did you draw the array wrong because you're rusty?" The act is a bit exaggerated, but rather effective all the same. Sure enough, Mingyi's face dropped. "Screw off! Draw it yourself if you have the skill." He said that, but he walked over nevertheless. Evidently, he hadn't noticed anything amiss. Shi Jingchuan was still frozen in place, so Shilian hurriedly moved on his behalf. He went over and put his arm under Mingyi's shoulder, assisting him. "Mingsheng, how are your injuries? The poison isn't getting worse, is it?" Mingyi shook his head. "It's fine. Let's find Lord Watermaster first." Shi Jingchuan nodded, and the two slowly made their way along the forest path. Shilian groaned with frustration, unable to find a chance to warn Shi Jingchuan of his suspicions. Suddenly, he felt his mouth fall open. Shi Jingchuan was soundlessly moving his lips. Shilian paid eager attention to the shapes he was forming. "Just what exactly is going on?" he said. Mingyi was so close to them and would surely notice. For fear of being discovered, Shilian lowered Shi Jingchuan's head slightly and responded with his lips as well. "He's fake." The moment the words fell from his lips, Shilian could feel goosebumps spring up on his arms. Shi Jingchuan's eyes bulged. "Fake? Then who is he?" he mouthed to him. Shilian gave his soundless answer. "The Reverend of Empty Words," he said. Shi Jingchuan drew in a sharp breath. Mingyi's voice came from ahead. "What is it?" Shi Jingchuan inhaled that sharp breath completely, then exhaled. His voice trembled as he replied. "I'm scared." Mingyi was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's too early to be scared." In the past, such a response would no doubt have been interpreted as a twisted form of comfort. But right now, it sounded like a threat, and the words radiated an unspeakable chill. Shi Jingchuan lowered his head and mouthed to Shilian, "No way! The Reverend of Empty Words can't shapeshift." Truthfully, Shilian had felt Reverend of Empty Words wasn't quite appropriate, even as the words left his mouth. It was too disrespectful, too impertinent. A few days ago, the Reverend of Empty Words that Shi Jingchuan had bumped into was no more than a minion, a pathetic clone, some leftover crumbs of the real thing. And so he gave a second answer. "Blackwater Demon Xuan." Shi Jingchuan tripped. "What's with you now?" Mingyi demanded. Shi Jingchuan's teeth were chattering. "I want to die." "Dream on," Mingyi responded coldly. There it was again. That familiar, frosty tone of voice and those equally icy, cruel words. It was the same as it had always been, but now it took on a completely different meaning. This was far from over. Shilian soundlessly gave a third name. Hexuan. Shi Jingchuan seemed unable to take it anymore, as Shilian could feel his heart pounding like a drum. Coincidentally, they were just crossing a small creek. Making a decision on the spot, Shilian said through Shi Jingchuan's mouth, "Mingsheng, I think you'd best rest a little before we continue searching." "You think we have time to rest now?" Mingyi replied. "You're poisoned. The more you move, the more the poison will cultivate," Shilian said for Shi Jingchuan. "Even if you don't want to rest, mortals like me have to. Sit down, I'll go get some water." He forced Mingyi to sit on the grass, trying his best to keep their hands and feet steady and to stop any visible shivering. He went to the creek alone, and once he got there, Shilian used the noise of the current to cover their hushed conversation. Shi Jingchuan cupped a palmful of water and splashed it on his own face to calm down. "Your Highness, what are you saying?" he hissed. "Who exactly is the person behind me? Did one of those three shapeshift into Mingsheng? Or did they all possess him at once?" "Lord Windmaster, calm down," Shilian said. "It's not them. It's him. There's only one person next to you right now. It's always been that same person right from the start. No one shapeshifted. No one was possessed." But Mingsheng, Shi Jingchuan mumbled. "Don't call him Mingsheng anymore. The real Mingsheng is long dead," Shilian said. "How do you know? Did you see?" Shi Jingchuan pressed him. "I wasn't the only one who saw," Shilian said. "You did too. The real Lord Earthmaster was the skeleton worshipped inside the Netherwater Manor. Why do you think he couldn't properly control the Earthmaster's crescent shovel? Is it because It's because it didn't belong to him in the first place. The one behind you, his original name, given centuries ago, was Hexuan. After cultivating into a supreme, his name became Blackwater Demon Xuan. He devoured the real Reverend of Empty Words and had it chase you. He imprisoned and murdered the real Earthmaster. He took on the Earthmaster's name long ago and assumed his position in the heavens. Just as he finished, he froze. A hand had tapped his shoulder without warning. And that is chapter 64.